14, nervous system, spinal cord, and spinal nerves. Before we start Chapter 14, I need to mention something about the previous chapter, Chapter 13. It was mentioned within the Chapter 13 main video on the nervous system that there are two items that are actually embedded within Eagle Online in the modules section. And on the screen here you see under modules something called instructors resources. And these two items that are now circled in front of you, Chapter 13 brain meninges and Chapter 13 cranial nerves. Now the reason why I'm bringing this out in this video is not only do you see Chapter 13 brain meninges, the meninges as mentioned before are continuous with the brain and the spinal cord. So please refer back to Chapter 13 brain meninges, the very short video when it comes to Chapter 14 again when we talk about the spinal cord. So I've already mentioned it in that chart. It's again mentioned in Chapter 14, but this time in reference to the spinal cord. We'll continue with our presentation. So we're now going to look at Chapter 14. So we're going to start with Chapter 14's slide. Okay. Now I'm going to get to a picture first, and that's this one here. Now this slide talks about the different segments of the spinal cord. Now I do not worry about this particular slide per se, but the reason why I'm bringing it out is because it's not the same as the vertebrae that you learned in the lab class when it came to the bone chapter. Notice the numbers don't match. If you recall cervical before in the bone chapter, in the vertebrae chapter, it was only 7 for cervical. Thoracic was 12, lumbar was 5, sacral was 5 fused into 1, and coccygeal was just 1. Well, just be aware it doesn't match the vertebrae that we had before. Next slide. Okay, this picture is important. This is page 538. So page 538. Now on page 538, you're going to find this picture, and the part I care for first is what's on the left-hand side. So we're going to talk about the different groupings. The first grouping I care for is cervical enlargement. Cervical enlargement. Now what I care about is just to be aware that it's a bundle or a grouping. So your spine, your spinal nerves, your spinal cords are grouped. And we have one grouping called cervical enlargement. That is all I want you to know, that there is such a thing as a cervical enlargement. Then moving further down, we have another one down here that I care for called conus medullaris. Now the conus medullaris is around, as shown here, around T12 or thoracic 12. That's where the spinal cord actually comes in, sort of like a tapered tapping iron kind of thing where it's tapered into a V shape, and that's why it's called conus medullaris. Okay, that takes care of the left-hand side for me. Now, what about these others? There's one more on the right side I care for, and that's called cauda equina. That actually translates to horse's tail. So cauda equina, horse's tail. Okay, so these are the ones from page 538 that you need to be aware of. I'll repeat all of them one more time. That's cervical enlargement, conus medullaris. Then we have on the opposite side, cauda equina. That's all I care for, page 538. Next slide. Don't care. Now, this one I do. Now, this picture on page 539 is something that was mentioned before in Chapter 13. I'm going to mention it again here. Remember, the outer part of the spinal cord is white matter. So the outside part of the spinal cord is white matter. The center is gray matter. Now, if you remember from a previous chapter, we said that white matter is because it's myelinated. So everywhere you see white, which is the outer part of the spinal cord, that white matter is containing myelinated neurons. So white matter will contain myelinated neurons. We also have something from the previous chapter about the gray matter. The gray matter is gray because its unmyelinated neurons are there. The other thing we have to bring over from chapter 13 is the fact that we have tracts. If you recall, in chapter 13, we had one kind of tract that went up and down the spinal cord. The tract that goes up and down the spinal cord was called a projection tract. That was from chapter 13 on the brain. It's being mentioned here again as a connection. So this is page 539 showing you the white matter and the gray matter of the spinal cord. Now the next thing I care about on page 539, the picture we're on, is this middle picture in terms of the area. Now that gray in the middle actually has parts. So we have the gray matter using the word horns. So we have a part of the gray matter that's a posterior part called posterior horn. We have a part of the gray matter that is a side, which is called lateral horn. And then we have a part of the gray matter that comes forward called anterior horn. So horn is a term used for the gray matter. The last picture on page 539 there on the far right mentions the stuff we've talked about, the white matter versus the gray matter. Okay, next slide. Don't care. Okay, this slide I do care. Now this is page 540. So this is page 540, but in words, we'll do it in picture form in a moment. Now if you recall, this is the slide that I started with today for chapter 14, mentioning the two short videos that are found in the modules section of Eagle Online under instructors resources. One of them was chapter 13, brain meninges. If you recall, the meninges is continuous with both the brain and the spinal cord as one big bag. Well, this slide that we're on now, slide number 10 for those interested, slide 10 here talks about the different forms of meninges, but this time for the spinal cord. I would highly advise going back to the chapter 13 brain meninges under instructors resources on Eagle Online because it has a chart, and that chart is relating to this particular slide as well. So instead of writing this slide, I would highly suggest that you go back to that one clip which deals with chapter 13 brain meninges. Okay? It's typically a handout, but I've turned it into a short video. You want to watch that one because it really covers this slide as well. Next slide. Okay. Before I move forward, let me ask a quiz question. In the short clip I mentioned, it says subarachnoid space. Well, that's the same subarachnoid space that is continuous with the brain and the spinal cord, and that's where your cerebrospinal fluid would be. So the cerebrospinal fluid, as with the brain, as with the spinal cord, is located in the subarachnoid space. We also mentioned at the very bottom of this slide, we see epidural space. That was a unique space only found for the spinal cord, not for the brain. Okay, so epidural space. That's the same epidural space that women who are pregnant and they're giving an epidural for childbirth, well, that epidural is given there. So that epidural space is where the epidural medicine is given. All right, next slide. This is now page 540 that I alluded to earlier. Now what we're going to do with this picture is we're going to go from the outside in. So I'm looking at the very back, and it says posterior. Well, you've already learned in the lab that this particular piece of your vertebrae is called the spinous process. So the spinous process is the back portion of that vertebrae piece. Then if I work forward, I see the epidural space. That epidural space is where that fatty area is. It's also the same area, as I mentioned a moment ago, where the epidural anesthesia is given during childbirth, in the epidural space. Then comes the thick part called the dura mater. Again, I'm working my way from the outer part in. So epidural space, then comes the dura mater. Below the dura mater, again using that chart that is available on Eagle Online, Chapter 13, Brain Meninges, below the dura mater is the subdural space. Then after the subdural space, we have the arachnoid mater. After the arachnoid mater, we have the subarachnoid space, which I mentioned now and in the previous video for Chapter 13. The subarachnoid space houses the cerebrospinal fluid. And then the most inner part is the pia mater. Now, mentioned on the Chapter 13's brain meninges that the pia mater is attached directly to the brain, while in this chapter, for Chapter 14, the pia mater is stuck directly onto the spinal cord. So this picture is actually an enlargement. The size of that spinal cord is about a little bit bigger than a typical pencil. Okay, so it's a little bit bigger than the typical pencil. So that spinal cord is pretty small. Okay, all right. So the pia mater directly attached to the surface of the spinal cord. Okay, next slide. Same page, 540. We'll do the same thing again. We're going to use the bottom picture because that's the outermost. So we have the dura mater. What's below the dura mater? The subdural space. What comes after the subdural space going inward is the arachnoid mater. What comes after the arachnoid mater? Subarachnoid space, where the cerebrospinal fluid is. And then what is directly attached to the spinal cord? And as you can see here on the far right, it is labeled as pia mater. It's directly attached to the surface of the spinal cord. Now, the next thing you want to get out of this picture, and it was again mentioned in Chapter 13 as well, is being repeated here. We have something called this portion right here called the dorsal root ganglion. It's also the same thing as a posterior root ganglion. And if you recall from Chapter 13, now mentioned in Chapter 14 again, the posterior or dorsal root ganglion has the cell bodies of sensory neurons. So cell bodies of sensory neurons. Now what does that mean to us? It means that the sensory information goes into the backside of the spinal cord and the motor information comes out the front side of the spinal cord. Let me say that again before we move forward. So sensory information comes into the backside of the spinal cord and motor information leaves the front side of the spinal cord. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is the lumbar puncture. I'm going to talk about that. And the number I care for, instead of writing all of this, is L4. I'll be mentioning it again in another context, but we're looking at L4, so lumbar 4. Again, I'm not on this slide per se, but I'm using it as a reference. So L4 is lumbar 4. That is a magic vertebrae piece. Anything above L4 is critical. Things below L4 are doable, but it depends. And here's what I mean by when I say depends. The undergarment. That means any damage below L4 will result in urinary issue, digestive issue, reproductive issue. Basically, the very last 3 chapters you find in A&P 2. So the 3 chapters being urinary chapter, digestive chapter, and reproductive chapter. So any damage below L4 will be a problem with those chapters. Anything above L4 will be critical to life, like breathing, for example. All right, next slide. Okay. All right, this is a repeat. I'll give you the page number anyway, but it is page 542, and it is a repeat. Okay, let me back to make sure. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, don't care. Now, this is a repeat of a previous information, so we're not writing that. All right, this is something we've already mentioned. I'll say it one more time. The page number is still page 542. This is again a repeat. It says sensory information goes into the back side of the spinal cord. So sensory goes into the back side, motor comes out the front side. Okay, next slide. I don't care. I don't care. Don't care. Don't care. Okay. This one I do care. Now, before I start this slide, I'm going to say it one more time. Sensory information comes into the back side of the spinal cord. Motor information leaves the front side of the spinal cord. Now, this is something you actually wrote down a long time back in Chapter 12 that's repeated here before we move any further. We already said that sensory information goes up to the brain. And we said that by using words like afferent, if you recall, in Chapter 12, Part 1's video. So sensory information goes afferent, which is up to the brain. So sensory is afferent, up to the brain. What was motor? Motor was down or descending. We call that efferent with an E. So motor was efferent and it's from the brain, from the spinal cord. So it is information previously discussed in Chapter 12. Okay, so now the bottom part. Now the bottom part is a term I want you to keep in mind, and that term is called decussation. Here's the other form of that word, decussate. Decussation or decussate means that the nerves crossed over. And you will see a picture of that later. But that's when the nerves cross over from one side to the other side. So if there's a nerve on the left, it actually crosses over the spinal cord side and comes over to the other side. And we'll see that. Now what this slide says is decussation requires a concept called contralateral. So decussation is contralateral. So anytime you have a nerve doing decussation, you know it deals with contralateral. Now here's how that works. Let's say you step on a nail with your left foot, but your right arm goes out to brace yourself. So look what happened in this scenario. The sensory information is on the left side, but the motor information is going out on the right side. Okay? So sensory came into the left, but motor's going out on the right. That's going to be decussation contralateral, where sensory is on one side, but the response would be for motor on the opposite side. That means it has to cross the spinal cord, therefore it's decussation contralateral. The last word on this slide is ipsilateral. Now ipsilateral is just same side. So if you stepped on the nail with your left foot, and your left arm went out to brace yourself, that would be ipsilateral. Here the sensory is on the left and the motor response is also on the left. Since it started as sensory on the left, motor's also going out on the left. That means it's ipsilateral, same side. Here it doesn't cross the spinal cord. Okay, next slide. Okay, now before I go any further, I'm on slide number 26, which I'll come back to in a moment. There's something you need to see. And I'm going to go back intentionally to show it to you. I gave you the names for the gray matter area as horns. In a little while, they're going to talk about the white matter area, all this white matter. The white matter area is called columns. So white matter, we call those areas columns. So there's an anterior column, there's a posterior column, and there's a lateral column. But again, columns are for the white matter, horns are for the gray matter. And I'm bringing that up now because the slide that I was at, which I'm now returning to, will mention that in a moment. Okay, I've skipped that slide. Skipping that slide, and I'm now going to go to this picture on page 544. So page 544. Now, am I still describing the previous terms? So am I still describing this slide number 26? Yes, I'm still describing slide number 26, this one here. But keep in mind that I'm going to show it to you in picture form. And that's page 544. Here's how it works. On this page, I see sensory information coming in. And remember, sensory information comes into the back side of the spinal cord. So it's coming in from some receptor somewhere. So if you have your hand on a hot plate, for example, your hand on a hot plate is getting burned and you're feeling the sensation on your hand, well, that's going to go up into the spinal cord, and it's going to go into the back side of the spinal cord. Now that first piece that goes from the receptor to the spinal cord is called primary or first order neuron. You will see it either way on a test. So let me repeat that before I go further. Receptor up to spinal cord. So receptor up to spinal cord, that is called first order, and some books call it primary neuron. Okay. All right, we'll move further. Now we're still in the same picture, but this time I'm going up the spinal cord. And if you notice, as I go up the spinal cord, look what happened. I crossed over to the opposite side. So as I went up, I crossed over to the opposite side, and notice the word there, decussation. And earlier we just said that if the nerve crosses over like that, then we're going to call that what? Or a neuron crosses over like that, we're going to call it decussation. So this is an example of a contralateral. So decussation, contralateral. Okay, now continuing, I'm going all the way up the spinal cord up to the thalamus. Now that's called second order or secondary neuron. So when I go up the spinal cord up to the thalamus, that's called secondary or second order neuron. All right, let me repeat the ones we've done so far. So we have from the receptor to the spinal cord is primary neuron or first order neuron. Then up the spinal cord up to the thalamus is second order or secondary neuron. Okay, now we'll do the last part. From the thalamus to the primary somatosensory. So thalamus to primary somatosensory. That's going to be your third order, or in this book they call it tertiary neuron. So from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory, that's third order or tertiary neuron. Now if you noticed, we're now mentioning something we mentioned in another chapter. It says thalamus. We said earlier in chapter 13's video on the brain that the thalamus is a major relay for sensory information. So thalamus is a major relay for sensory information. We also said this primary somatosensory. So things like PPTT, pressure, pain, touch, temperature, the things that we saw in the skin chapter for sensation. So the sensations of your skin, PPTT, pressure, pain, touch, temperature, actually go to the primary somatosensory. Okay, all right, next slide. Okay. Now, this is one tract you want to know by name, and that's the spinothalamic tract. Now, the way these names come out, they're named based upon direction. So spinothalamic tract means that it's going up the spinal cord. And as we've already learned, things that are going up the spinal cord are called sensory, right? Things that are going to the brain, up to the spinal cord and above, that's going to be sensory. Right? So spinal or spinothalamic tract being sensory. Now notice the last word there, tract. Remember we mentioned earlier today, even as well as in the chapter 13's video for brain, that we have these tracts that go up and down. Well, in this case, this is a sensory tract that I'm speaking of. This is the elevator going up to the brain. So that's why it's called a tract. And it, again, is an example of our projection tract. Okay, next slide. All right, here's another one on page 545, showing you again coming as a primary neuron or first order from the receptor. And if you look at the wording here, it says pain, temperature, touch, pressure. Isn't that our PPTT? Pressure, pain, touch, temperature. And it goes up the spinal cord. We have our first order neuron from the receptor to the spinal cord. We have our secondary neuron, which goes up the spinal cord, up to the thalamus. And we have our third order that goes to the primary somatosensory. That was page 545. Next slide. Okay, here's another one you need to know by name. This one's called the spinocerebellar tract. Now, I don't care about memorizing all of this on the slide, but you do need to know that spinocerebellar is a sensory tract. Now, where do you think it goes to by its very name? It goes to the cerebellum. Now, what kind of information do you think that the cerebellum is getting through this? Information about balance. So in Chapter 13 on the brain, we learned that the cerebellum plays a role in fine-tuned motor control. So this is giving you information about how your body is moving. Okay, next slide. Here's a picture version on page 545 at the bottom, showing you the spinocerebellar tract. Next slide. Here is a pattern showing you the tracts. Again, tracts are part of the white matter. So tracts are part of the white matter. Now on page 546, and in many textbooks have this, there'll be a chart. And the ones I've called out to you that are important to me are the spinothalamic and the spinocerebellar. Now most books have it broken down into anterior and lateral, anterior and posterior. I don't care about that. Just be aware that in general, what does the spinothalamic do and what does the spinocerebellar do? And that's on page 546. Most books have such a chart. Okay, now we move to motor. So this time we're going down from the brain, down the spinal cord. So from the brain, down. Now, this time around, we're not going to have 3 segments, but only 2. The first segment, listed here in the first bullet, is called upper motor neuron. So upper motor neuron. The upper motor neuron goes from the primary motor. If you recall from Chapter 13's video on the brain, we learned that upper motor neuron starts at the primary motor, where we have that section of the brain in front of the sulcus, that central sulcus. So the area in front of that central sulcus was called primary motor, and this is where the upper motor neuron will start. So let me classify it one more time. Upper motor neuron starts at the primary motor and it goes down the spinal cord. Okay, that's the first part. The second one is the lower motor neuron. Lower motor neurons leave the spinal cord. They are the ones that actually go to the muscle. So when we were on the muscle chapter a while back on Chapter 10, we actually learned that we have such a thing as a motor neuron. Well, these are your motor neurons, which are the same we're speaking of now. So the lower motor neurons leave the spinal cord. So we only have 2 parts. Upper motor neuron that comes from the top of the brain down the spinal cord, and then we have the lower motor neurons which leave the spinal cord. Now on this page 546, you see this picture here. These are the ones that are typically the motor neurons. So we're going to go down this picture here on the right. The first one you need to know is corticospinal. So corticospinal. So again, it makes sense. It starts off at the cortex of the brain and goes down the spinal cord. The next one you see there is rubrospinal. The next one after that is reticulospinal. The next one after that is vestibulospinal. And the next one after that is tectospinal. Now on page 548, and this is found in every book, page 548 shows a chart with these exact tracts labeled for you. So you have the corticospinal, rubrospinal, reticulospinal, vestibulospinal, and tectospinal. And every book has a chart. And what you need to know for the purpose of the test is what their final function is. So the final function of each of those. Page 548 in your book, and many textbooks have a chart explaining the function of each of these that you see in the picture. Okay, next slide. Don't care. Now this is another way you can do it. So if you don't want to use the chart that's in the book on page 548, you can also use the PowerPoint slides for the same thing. Okay, now here's a picture version. As you can see on this picture, and this is page 547, you can see that on page 547, this motor track, because you know it's motor because it's going down the spinal cord and down the brain, we see we're starting at the primary motor that I mentioned. And then from the primary motor, I'm going down the spinal cord, and that's going to be called my upper motor neuron. So the primary motor going down the spinal cord will be the upper motor neuron. And what do you see at the bottom? At the bottom, I see that it's being removed or released from the spinal cord. So what leaves the spinal cord? The lower motor neuron leaves the spinal cord. You also even see it saying skeletal muscle there. So this is the same motor neuron we had in chapter 10 and 11 on muscles. We also notice that this time the motor neuron is coming out of the front of the spinal cord, because remember, motor stuff comes out the front of the spinal cord. That was page 547. Okay, all right, here's another chart. This is the same one that I referred to a moment ago, which was page 548, or you can also use this chart, your choice. All right, here's a person with their hand on the hot plate on the stove. They're burning their finger there. As they burn their finger, the sensory information goes up the spinal cord, up to the brain. And as you can see, as it goes up, it has how many pieces that we've already seen? The primary neuron. So this is the primary neuron, or the first order neuron. Then we have our secondary or second order neuron, and then our third order neuron on the way up, because this is sensory. Then on the way down, for that person to remove their hand from the hot plate, the motor neuron pathway will be upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron. Okay, next slide. All right. Next piece of information is going to go with this slide. That takes me to page 550 in the textbook, and this is now spinal nerves. You will need to know that we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. That's going to be important. So we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Now, if you recall from chapter 12, part 1, and that's why I'm putting it in the video, we said that we have spinal nerves and we have cranial nerves. Cranial nerves leave the brain. Spinal nerves leave the spinal cord. And therefore, these items that leave the brain or leave the spinal cord, they're part of the peripheral nervous system. So the spinal nerves and then the cranial nerves in chapter 13, they were peripheral nervous system. Okay. All right, next slide. Don't care. Don't care. Don't care. Okay, this slide I do care. The slide is called dermatome or dermatome. So dermatome or dermatome. It won't make sense until I go to the next slide. So dermatome or dermatome. Now what is it? It is actually a sensory map of the skin. So dermatome or dermatome is a sensory map of the skin. Okay, here's the picture on page 551. We're going to take an illustrative example of L3 on this person's leg there, that thigh area, L3. Now, if I were to take a pin and scrape gently on this person's leg right here where it says L3, that sensory information about me scraping the surface of his skin is going to go up from where that is on the leg up to the spinal cord. And what spinal cord segment is it going to? L3. That's what this map tells me. That right there on that person's thigh, I have L3, and that's where that information is going to the L3 portion of his spinal cord segment. Now, why is that an important fact? Well, let's say I am scraping right here, and the patient says, I feel nothing. Well, if there's no feeling me scraping right here on L3, it means that one possibility is that the sensory nerve or the sensory neuron that goes to the spinal cord may be burned out or fried or damaged, and that'd be the first portion. So we have our primary order, or our first order, that may be damaged. Or at the L3 segment of the spinal cord, you may have damage. So that's a problem. So that's what a dermatome tells the doctor. Is it the primary neuron or the first order neuron up to that spinal cord segment of L3 that's damaged, or is it thereafter? Like all the way up to the brain. The other reason for a dermatome is for surgery. If they want to intentionally not give someone a general anesthesia, where they have to knock out the person completely, but want to operate on a certain part of the body without knocking them out completely, then what they can do is give a spinal injection such that it only numbs what area? L3. So when they numb the L3 segment of the spinal cord, then anything that they're operating on, that feeling of sensory, won't reach the brain. And therefore, the brain will never know that you are working on anything. Therefore, you don't feel any pain. Remember, the pain is happening because of our understanding of the pain. If you don't even know what pain is, then you won't even have the understanding of the pain either. So here we have L3. So if I were to numb the L3, then the patient would not know that I'm even touching this area, because no sensory information would either even reach L3, or at L3 it would stop and it'll never get to the brain for any interpretation of the pain at all. Now, two things to remember. One, when it comes to this L3 right here that I'm on, there's a 50% overlap. So if I really wanted to numb L3 in my illustration, not only would I have to numb L3, but L2 and L4 as well, because there's a 50% overlap between these. So if I'm working on L3, I'd have to ensure no pain by numbing L2 and L4. Okay. All right, next slide. All right, shingles. Most textbooks have a clinical box on page 552. So if you have a clinical box on page 552 on shingles, make sure you understand how shingles work. Now, first of all, it is due to the chickenpox virus. So the chickenpox virus is causing shingles. Now, where does it reside? Once you've had chickenpox, okay, it stays dormant in the posterior root ganglion, or the dorsal root ganglion, as I call it. So the dorsal root ganglion can harbor the virus that causes chickenpox, and then when the immune system is weak later in life, it pops out as shingles, and it's much worse than chickenpox. So that information is on page 552, or the clinical box that you find in your book. Okay, now draw a line again, and now we have the title here, nerve plexus. You're not writing all of this, but I do want you to know the title. Now, a nerve plexus, or plexus in itself, is a bundle. It's a bundle of nerves. That's how the textbook definition goes. It's a bundle of nerves. Okay, so that's what a plexus is. It's a bundle of nerves. Now, we're going to look at a couple of them. Okay, we're going to start with this one, which is the cervical plexus. Now, this is the one that's going to be at the neck region, right? Cervical is referring to the neck. So the cervical plexus. Now, you do need to know this example. So as I go through the different plexuses, you're going to see that I provide a key example. You're going to need to know that for now, and maybe even in A&P 2. So the first one we're on is cervical plexus. It's in the neck region, right? Cervical plexus in the neck. And the key example is phrenic nerve. Now, the phrenic nerve works the diaphragm. So yes, the phrenic nerve working the diaphragm, found in the neck region, deals with breathing. So in A&P 2, you'll come across that. So the phrenic nerve deals with breathing with the diaphragm. Okay, next slide. Don't care. Okay, now the next one after that is brachial plexus. The brachial plexus. Now this one is sort of the neck and shoulder and arm. So neck, shoulder, and arm is going to be the brachial plexus. So neck, shoulder, arm. Okay, neck, shoulder, arm. Brachial plexus. Again, I don't care for any of this information on the slide. I do care for what's about to come up. So for brachial plexus, neck, shoulder, and arm, and we're going to see a slide that has the different branches of it. That's going to be important coming up. Alrighty, now this slide is important. These are the 5 branches of the brachial plexus. You will need to know this slide well. It's slide number 59, and it's important because you'll see differences here. The first branch is axillary nerve. So the first branch is axillary nerve. Now for test purposes, be aware that that deals with crutches as well. So if you use the crutches the wrong way and press underneath the armpit, you may end up damaging or hurting the axillary nerve. And so some people call it crutch paralysis. So if you use crutches the wrong way, you'll end up getting axillary nerve damage or crutch paralysis. Okay, moving to the next one, median nerve. Okay, median nerve. Now the median nerve deals with your nerve going to your wrist area. So the median nerve deals with carpal tunnel syndrome. So if someone who types a lot, they may end up getting carpal tunnel syndrome, and that's median nerve. Okay, the next one is musculocutaneous. I have nothing more for that one. And the next one after that is radial nerve. Now the radial nerve is sometimes attributed to what's called wrist drop. A wrist drop is in a position like a waiter would be. Sometimes they call it the waiter's position or wrist drop, where a waiter is waiting for a tip. That's because the radial nerve affects the wrist in such a way that it does not allow the arm to extend. Okay? So they're in a bent wrist position like a waiter would be. So radial nerve, wrist drop. The last one is ulnar nerve. We've all come across this one when we hit our elbow on the table and we get that little sharp feeling that goes all the way to our pinky. Well, that is the ulnar nerve. Okay, so these are the 5 branches of the brachial plexus. Okay, next slide. Don't care. Here's a picture version on page 555. Not so much for the lecture, but more for the lab. So brachial plexus, again, is the neck, arm, and shoulder. Okay, I already talked about this, so I'm skipping it. Skipping. Okay, now we go towards the leg area. So this is now shown on page 560 and 561 in our book. For me, for lumbar, I only care for one key one, and that is the femoral nerve. So when it comes to lumbar plexus, it's the femoral nerve. So lumbar plexus, femoral nerve. Next slide. Okay. Again, here's a picture version. So lumbar plexus, femoral nerve. Okay, the next one is sacral plexus. Now the sacral plexus has a very important nerve. As you can see down here, it says sciatic nerve. It's the largest and longest nerve in the body. So sciatic nerve, largest and longest nerve in the body. Now the sciatic nerve is often referred to as the pain in the butt. All right, so the pain in the butt. Because if you actually injure the sciatic nerve, you're not only going to have butt pain, but leg pain down all the way to the knee area and all the way down to the ankle area. And if you didn't know that, then you would think it's an ankle problem or a knee problem when the actual injury is at the sciatic nerve in the back lower back. All right, next slide. Now these are the two main branches that you need to know. So the sciatic nerve has two branches. The first one is tibial, and the second one at the bottom is the common fibular. Okay, the common fibular. Now for test purposes, you will be asked what area controls what. And so on page 565 of your book, they mention that. And it mentions it on this slide as well. So the tibial deals with the sole of the foot. So the bottom of the foot. So the tibial will deal with the bottom of the foot. Okay. The common fibular will deal with the front part of your foot. Okay, it'll deal with the front part of your foot. Okay. So the fibular part deals with the front part. So the common fibular will deal with the front part of your foot, whereas the tibial nerve will deal with the back part and the sole of your foot. Okay. All right. Next slide. Don't care. Don't care now. Don't care. Again, you can see in this picture, we have the tibial nerve. The tibial will deal with the back part of your leg and the sole of your foot, whereas the common fibular nerve will deal with the front part of your foot and the lower part of the foot. All right, next slide. I don't care too much about this. Again, I've already mentioned that the sciatic nerve goes right down that place. And then if you injure your butt area or you got a poorly designed shot, so some people give a shot the wrong way, then you can have injury to the sciatic nerve. And you'll have a pain in the butt that goes all the way down to your ankle and to your knee. Okay, don't care. Okay, let me back up. The next part in the last section of chapter 14 deals with reflexes. First of all, you need to know that reflexes are involuntary. Now, I have another way to remember that, and that is reflexes are no-brainers. The brain, the higher levels of the brain are not involved in reflexes. If you recall from chapter 13 on the brain chapter, we mentioned that the bottom part of the brain, the brainstem, which is the animal brain mentioned at that time, the brainstem deals with reflexes because it's really not higher level work from the brain. So reflexes are involuntary responses. Okay, next slide. This is a very important picture on page 566. All textbooks have a picture like this. So all textbooks have a picture called the reflex arc. So the reflex arc. And in our book, it's page 566. Now, we're going to look at this 5-step process. The first step is the receptor. So in this example, we see a nail in the foot. Okay. That nail is going to send sensory information by way of the receptor. Again, going through the dorsal root ganglion. And you can see the cell body right there. And then it goes into the back side of the spinal cord. So that's the first step, starting with the receptor. Second, being the sensory neuron and reaching step 3. Now, step 3 is shown as a purple color. That purple one is called an interneuron. And in chapter 12, I mentioned that interneurons are also called association neurons. So interneuron or association neuron. And then we have two options. Either we send it down this tract that goes up to the brain. Remember, we do get knowledge about what we've done. So if you have a nail in your foot, well, now you know what it feels like because you remembered the event. All that goes up to the brain. Or we can have a quick response, which is out the motor aspect or the motor part. So this is now the front part down the motor neuron. And as you recall from chapter 12, part 1, we have something called an effector. Well, that effector is a muscle or a gland. Okay. So we have step 1, step 2, up to step 3, which was the sensory part. And then we have step 4 and 5, which is the motor part. Now, let's go back to this middle portion. We already said that interneuron plays this role of connecting sensory with motor. Do you recall in chapter 12, part 1, we mentioned a term that deals with the SIM card example, which was I, and I was integration or processing. So the spinal cord plays the role of integration or processing by way of interneurons or association neurons. And this is page 566. Next slide. Don't care. Again, notice the previous knowledge is now back. Ipsilateral versus contralateral, and we've already talked about that. All right, this picture I don't really care too much about except the boxes at the top here. So monosynaptic. Now notice if I follow the blue line, I see only one synapse here. And that's why it's called monosynaptic. Over here on the right, I actually see two. Polysynaptic, meaning 1 and 2. So I see two of them. Okay, so I see two there. So polysynaptic being two or more synapses or connections. Okay, next slide. Okay, don't care. Okay, this picture I do care. This is page 568. All books mention this. It's called a stretch reflex. Now, here we have a muscle. So this is page 568, a muscle. Now you're thinking, wait a second, a muscle is supposed to be motor. Well, not really true. That's what you learned early on. But muscles are not only sensory, but they're also motor. So what's the sensory part of a muscle? Well, it's called muscle spindle. Now I'm going to give you another word that shows up in A&P 2, and that's called proprioceptor. So a muscle spindle is sometimes called proprioceptor, which simply means a stretch receptor. That's what it is. It's a stretch receptor. So a proprioceptor or a muscle spindle is nothing more than a stretch receptor. And here we see a sensory information coming out of the muscle, because muscle spindle, proprioceptors, or stretch receptors, that's sending out a sensory information. Then it goes to the spinal cord. Here's our interneuron as before, and then on one side, for one muscle, it may say contract. On another muscle, it may say relax, because you don't want both muscles contracting at the same time. So one muscle is told to relax, one muscle is told to contract. And that's how that works. That's page 568. Okay, moving on. Okay, this is now page 569. Now on this picture, we see a similar thing. We see a muscle sending information. Okay, so we have a muscle here sending information and then a response. So this is page 569. I don't care too much about this one. Okay, the last one I do care for is this picture on page 570. Now on page 570, you see a person who has stepped on something sharp with their right foot. So this is the person's right foot, and we see them stepping on something sharp. So here we have a sensory pain going up the spinal cord from the skin. So sensory pain going up the spinal cord, going into the sensory part, and then we have two storylines. One storyline is on the same side. See how I'm on one side of the body but coming out on the same side. So that's going to be your ipsilateral. Ipsilateral, because the pain, which is sensory, and the motor, well, the motor's on the same side too for that leg, which basically says I feel the pain on that leg, the right leg, and the right leg muscles will now tell me to move that same leg. That's what's happening in this story with this loop. But at the same time, the opposite leg is told, that's the other leg, the left leg, is told to stand firm. Because when you lift one leg up, you want to make sure you don't fall, so the other leg is now sturdy and firm. So again, we have the right leg, both sensory and motor, and that's why it's a loop, and it's a ipsilateral loop. And then on the opposite side, for the other leg, we have this loop. And notice, what do I see here in this purple? This purple shows it going across. And if you recall from this chapter, we said that anytime a neuron crosses over, it's called decussation, contralateral. So yes, we have a contralateral shown here because it goes to the opposite side. Okay, next slide. Don't care, 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 and that's the end of our presentation.